Welcome everyone, and thanks to Arts Cabinet for the invitation. It is great honor to be in conversation with you today, Nikolaus. And would you first introduce yourself to us? Like, if you were to describe yourself and your artistic practice, perhaps in 3 sentences, what would they be?
Hello, also from my side, welcome. And, it's a pleasure to have this conversation with you, Fatoş. Yeah, how to describe oneself in 3 sentences. I would say I'm an artist, I'm a performer, and I'm a researcher, and I have an ongoing practice of trace making and space making in this kind of relational field between thinking and drawing in action. I have a particular interest in these threshold zones in between thinking, drawing, and knowing, and certainly the unknowing, or I would say the not yet knowing. With this configuration of thinking, drawing, knowing, I mean the intrinsic entanglement of these 3 practices. For me, it is a reflexive set of practices and kind of an ecology, one could say, performed as the infinite loop of observing oneself, observing, and thus generating new forms of knowledge kind of in the making.
Mm-hmm. That is actually quite interesting, because this fact of like observing oneself, observing also goes to cognition. And when you're also saying about this kind of like in between spaces of thinking, drawing, knowing or unknowing, it makes me think about Derrida and the concept that he coined, or the term that he coined, unthought, which refers to this kind of like domain of, let's say, domain of thoughts that have not been yet visualized, observed, or documented. And he kind of like talks about, let's say, human evolution of knowledge through the unpacking of unthought, but kind of like makes analogical connection between a horizon line, so that whenever you reach the horizon line, it is, it escapes you, it's inexplicable in some way or form. So unthought is like that. And then he kind of like says that about the fact that, philosophers progress in time through depicting the unthought areas or unthought thoughts of their predecessors. So it's very curious, actually.
Yes, I can very much relate to that, what you just said. And for me, it's also very much related to how drawing, the practice of drawing, performs for me. When you draw, you make lines on a surface, and you could say that is drawing. But I prefer to follow the line from the surface, kind of into the pencil, into the fingertips, into the hand. My whole arm is then becoming part of the drawing. My shoulder, the table I'm sitting at, the chair, my body position, my shirt, my shoes, the room I'm in, its temperature, the things I'm with. So you see the line jumps on and into my mind and back on the paper, influencing my lines of thought, influencing what I see and how I draw further and how I draw on and on. So where is the drawing now situated, and where are the lines operating? That's something I'm questioning myself. So, and also, who is drawing here? Who is the draughtsman? So to say.
But it's quite interesting that you're kind of like really creating almost like an intrinsic connection with the corporeality of the artist and the artwork. And I think it's also about that kind of like tangibility. I remember like, for instance, the Italian writer, author, Cesare Pavese said like, like, write me a letter. That way you have a tangibility and you would have a solid presence, and this kind of, let's say, this kind of like connection of the line, the drawing, the surface, and the arm. It's very curious. But let's kind of like expand that onto also research as artistic practice, which is something that you employ in your practice. And can you perhaps tell us a bit about like how does research how manifests in your case as practice?
Yes, I like very much the reference or the link between writing and drawing, especially when it was still done by hand, as a kind of coded line, which is so full of information, like thinking also in the interpretation and graphology and so on. But this process I just tried to describe you is how I basically relate to research. And here I would like to include a tiny line between the re and the search, kind of like this hyphen, not to separate them, but actually to bring them in a connection, in a tension towards each other. So I think first it needs curiosity somehow to move into or with something unknown as a starting point for a research process. And then I think staying with the trouble, so to say, staying in that state of mind of searching for connections. And then a form of persistence or endurance is needed to keep on going and to come back to something all over again. I would say in this repetitive rhythm or elementary gesture of the of this towards renewal or restoration or reflection, actually the research, the sense making is taking place. I mean, one could also say, in other words, what do I do when I do? So kind of, this is my very key understanding of fundamental artistic research in simple words. And maybe another important point to add is you cannot research something that is already known. Somehow I think it needs the unknown, which one is trying to get in touch with. So I mean, as we know, artistic research is still a quite young field, not yet fully settled, which I think makes it also interesting for me to find my way, my roots through it. I would say I share interest in those ways supporting more the epistemological aspect of artistic exploration, like including the senses or the affective knowledges. For example, I mean, one could say like exploring a space via the haptic senses or other aesthetic practices in the deep meaning of the word aesthetic, like coming from aesthesis, the Greek term. Also integrating the tricky terrain of emotions, which are often cut away in the sciences. All forms of bodily knowledges, I think, are interesting to integrate through performative practices of attention. And I think the value of trial and or error, or also of somehow more, I would say, like feeling one's way through, kind of also allowing very idiosyncratic ways of relating to the world. And here I'm thinking more of a real, I would say, like radical subjectivity versus the dictum of the objectiveness of research. So all these notions of intuition or not knowing are central to me. I think this also valuing these in-between states or states of ambivalence.
That's quite that's quite interesting, actually. And I feel like there's a lot to unpack on research, because it's also about, you said one thing that's very important is like, the primary condition for research is not knowing something. But then I think there's also kind of like an invisible condition that is the intent to know, intent to engage, and through that engagement, openness to be changed, to be, like, let's say, transformed. I mean, I kind of like am trying to kind of get to this kind of idea of artistic practice as research as artistic practice, with the kind of like the tool that you employ a lot in your works, which is diagramming as an artistic method, and how do those two correlate?
Yeah, I think I could come back to the example I gave you before, like following the line from the paper to the pen into the body and back again. And here my interest is diagramming this in between space or in between states also of this thinking, drawing, knowing. So I have cultivated practices of, I would say, like from noticing to note taking to notation and also annotation. And here the space around me is not conceived, so to say, as something else or as kind of a neutral, theoretical or mathematical entity or container, like if we think of the idea of the Euclidean space, but in contrast as I would say like a vibrant field of manifold forces, which needs to be inhabited with the whole body, with my senses, and with the practice, which is rather process and product orientated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's quite interesting about this kind of like this noticing, notes, notation, annotation relationship, and how it could also be, like mapped as a diagram. But like if we go back to, I don't know, let's say the dictionary definitions of diagrams, they can be defined as pictures of language uttered in a way that its components are put in nonlinear associations with each other. And let's say these kind of like they create asymmetric juxtapositions, which might then lead to, a kind of, I feel, an expanded version of elaboration of a complex thought. And there is that kind of like diagrams have that force of protecting or preserving the complexity of that and visualizing it at the same time. So let's kind of like keep on thinking about diagrams in your practice, and maybe like, can you tell us a bit more about like what is your motivation? What drove you to diagram in the first place?
Well, it's a long-held fascination, which I try to kind of unpack through my practice. But I would say there are two predominant approaches to the diagram. One regards them more as servants or tools to explain complexity, as you said. And another regards them as kind of more free radicals that don't serve to transmit logic, but are more anarchic structures that destabilize the conundrum of the status quo. Yeah? So that is where their diagrammatic logic, they can create chaos, starts to operate. Yeah? And by doing so, they allow these interspaces or in-between spaces to emerge, and these nuances come forth. And my research, I would say, addresses this more the poetic space of the diagram, the space of interpretation, but also misinterpretation, the space of subjectivity, the space of parallel readings, the space also of deviation, the space of translation. So the space where the diagram would not only take care of order and stability. So as if you think of the first example, like using them as data visualization or infographics in scientific figures, but rather flip to this gesture of destabilizing and discovering in this kind of more fractious borderland between art, science, and also fiction, which is, I think, more a Deleuzian way of thinking around the diagram.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in this, in the ambivalent character of the diagram, the moment of this collapse or flipping, like a Janus head. It can flip while explaining something and then distract it and make kind of nonsense again. Yeah. So I welcome diagrams more as, I would say, like as agents, which operate in a more bipolar or even paradoxical sense, in this kind of more speculative interstitial space or interspace of if and or yes but or as well as, or so kind of, rather than in a binary space of black and white or yes or no. Yeah. So I think artists are more drawn to the latter character of the diagram, whereas scientists employ them as tools and as functional entities. And as diagrams are these operational drawings, they escape this dialectics of presence and absence, which pervades the play of, I would say, of representation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's quite interesting to think about diagrams as servants as well as, like radicals. Mm-hmm. And I do agree with you, like this kind of like the radical nature of diagrams would be more appealing to artists, and especially this kind of like the continuous flipping of, like convictions. And but I feel like in your practice, you do employ both in a very kind of like a cognizant way, and that still has the poetic aspect of the diagram, but also at the same time this kind of like illustrative nature of phases and processes of thinking, mapping, charting, and kind of like in a way like this kind of urge of getting to a form of knowledge. And I feel like that is like also in a way like that gives your work the strength that it's like kind of like in a way like fluctuates between forms of presentation from evidence-backed, like representations, or like constellation of, almost like ideograms, like kind of micro thoughts that are randomly put together and almost looks like they're kind of like hanging in the air, like in that temporality of space-time, and they're only existing there and then. And after, like the audience is gone or the exhibition is over, they will kind of like reconfigure themselves. It's almost this kind of like frozen moment. Yeah,
I can fully agree with what you said, and I think like I like both sides, both elements. And I think what I'm working on or trying to approach with my art is to create a kind of a tunnel or a zone of fluctuation between these two often understood kind of dichotomic entities. I mean, it's maybe very simple also, like our neck is often understood as this like bottleneck, like this tiny channel, but it should not be a border, no? So Western thinking is making this distinction between the body and the head. And I think my work is really keeping that kind of zone transitionary porous, allowing flux and exchange. And I love to reflect upon things, but also work on bringing these often suppressed forces of vitality into the work.
I love the neck example. I think it's a very visceral example to kind of really understand this dichotomy of mind and body. And but it's also about, like, in your work, you're very much kind of engaged with and informed by other disciplines and forms of knowledge and knowledge production. And in a way, my question is, like, do you think like that this gives you a certain level of freedom to, like, arrive at these disciplines other than art, but then engage with them on a meta level? Or, like, for instance, like, if I can say in other words, it's like does being an artist give you a license of, just like engaging with other formations of knowledge from, rather playful, undefined or unjustified means?
Yeah, the license. I would say, like, I'm driven by a form of inspiration or fascination, also to listen to different concepts and ways of understanding, explaining, and making sense in this super complex world we live in. So I like the idea of sciences as a form also of narrating, or kind of fiction, also as a way of a possible kind of storytelling, how things might be connected. And yes, as an artist, somehow one has the bonus of this kind of lateral thinking or cross-disciplinary thinking, or one could also say more undisciplinary thinking, undisciplined. So that goes beyond boxes or categorical determinations. Again, I think the curiosity is important to learn, but also to think and with and further, and then to kind of allow oneself to speculate also about potentialities, to fabulate, and then to deviate somehow, to allow the drift. I like to explore other forms of logics, kind of alien logics, to give way to the paradoxical and the poetic, and so the non-linear. And I think all these kind of spaces of knowing, which are normally suppressed or sublimated, neglected, or marginalized, it's important to put focus on them. And these are often kind of rendered out of the so-called sense data, sense-related data, in order to keep them somehow clean and clear, as if it would be dirty, to think emotionally, or however. I think there is a strange gesture implemented in this kind of clearing, and and I think this is often happening in the humanities, and these other forms of knowledge are taken away, and I sense it could be a crucial role especially for artistic research, to bring these often overseen elements back, kind of into the game of knowledge, of knowledge production. I think, Western knowledge economy tends to favor, I think, the rational, and the discursive and the logic ways, where the knowledge is somehow transmitted or traded as a product, and rather than necessarily activated as a live embodied process.
I think it's quite interesting also, like, that you kind of like underline several times about the Western way of thinking, because I think it's also like, since modernity, there is this kind of like divergence of sciences. And then, of course, like it came, the kind of urge of efficiency came along. And I totally agree with you about, this kind of like radical elimination of data in order to make sense of something. And sometimes, like for instance, in maths, there's always an error. But then like if you only take the error into account, and only if it is at a certain percentage of what you're trying to find, and then you create principles, and then there could be this kind of like divergent data that is like sitting there, which might lead to discovering another form of reality. Let's kind of like I don't want to kind of like bore you with like maths, but like I want to kind of like come back to this artistic process of like as a like phase of production, and I feel like artistic processes are like diegetic phases for an artwork. And like it's very seldom that artists focus on process as practice. And in many of your projects, exhibitions, the process comes to fore as method and as the means to the work. So can you perhaps like tell us a bit more about like, your like what is a process for you, and how your process as an artist can be, passed on to audiences as art experience?
Yes, I think no artwork is without kind of process. The product is often fetishized and commodified, as we know, by the art market, but the process somehow too. Or it's more mystified, the process. If you think of the trope of I would say like the white male painter genius or whatever, in his studio. So in response to also as a male artist, white male artist, I think I would say I have developed a self-reflexive practice. I'm not a big fan of abstraction, but I believe in complexities and making complexities tangible, not via mere abstraction, but via other complexities or other complex systems or meshworks, kind of creating contact zones for the audience. Yeah. So to get in touch with it, literally maybe. Yeah. I also trust that there are basic human ways of sense making which can be understood and communicated through the art to the audience. I'm aiming for a way to not make a distinction of first comes the research and then the artwork supersede, but to produce art that is intrinsically connected to its processes and its phases also of research. I think the outcome is not showing the process, but starting always a new beginning that has sparked off as a state of mind, of artistic kind of research. As we said, both are somehow mystified to a certain extent, that the artwork work and what happened in the studio of the genius that led to the creation of the blah, blah, blah masterpiece. So I think in a similar vein, scientists and the invention of new findings is often mystified, but it's also never linear. Yeah, there are always obstacles, moments of not knowing and not knowing further, of being somehow blocked, stuck. I think none of us wants to talk about these kind of hardships, but I believe these are as significant and valuable to the outcome as the flow of production. Yeah? I think it's significant to be able to address and to also find a way of talking about it, yeah, to communicate these little struggles, yeah, in your own journey. Perhaps the process of something that appears to you becomes through this way tangible. And sometimes I think it is not accessible to the outsider. However, it is still charged, yeah, within the work and transmitted through these phases of flow and obstruction, and can then kind of be felt by others.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very beautifully put. And I really like the idea of, like the new beginning, that, like that is the artwork, and that the new beginning is for the research and the processes, but that's like kind of this marking is very interesting.